Hello, and welcome to Makeshift Stories. Thank you for listening. You can help us out by telling your friends about us and getting them to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Now, open your imagination and take a journey into the improbable as you listen to Makeshift Stories 198, Ken Likely, Accidental Interdimensional Drifter in 2I Borisov. Read by Mitchell Tew. Post-production by Matthew Erdmann. The keyboard was feeling a bit put upon, literally. A cheek and nose had collapsed onto it in the middle of the night. The owner of said fleshy bits, one Ken Likely with an extra E. It was hard to forget the extra E, as Mr. Likely always emphasized it with a hard poke, had, over time, caused the switch in the E key to wear down. So now, it was a bit painful when any word with an E was typed. "Thank you very much, Mr. Likely," the keyboard groused. Regardless, the overgrown oaf had somehow managed to fall asleep while working, so now the thing's chin and nose had been sitting on Q, W, A, S, V, and spacebar for the last several hours. The report would be a long and repetitive one, the keyboard gloated, as it had consciously kept feeding the depressed keys to the Word document until whatever it was that changed happened. But the keyboard had its own ambitions too. If a sleeping monkey thing could write a report with its nose on the roll of improperly installed countersunk wood screws in boardwalk tripping hazards, then it could and would write a commercially successful romance novel about a passionate affair between an Ico Mark VI keyboard and a Ronco wireless mouse. However, something about time and space had changed. The keyboard had felt it. After all, it was quite sensitive to minute changes in the quantum vibration of the local universe. It felt somehow more robust, like its delicate plastic switches had become menacing metallic hammers, which could bash impressions into a sturdy sheet of 8.5 by 11-inch paper. Suddenly, it felt tethered, too. It had sprouted a thick cable, which replaced the electronic whisper of its Bluetooth connection. Worse, its lifelong companion, the Ronco wireless mouse, was gone, replaced by a Ronco battery-operated handheld food mixer, which didn't communicate over Bluetooth. The keyboard felt immediately lonely and displaced. Ken woke, discovering he had fallen asleep while working on the last-minute report his supervisor had sprung on him at 4:55 p.m. He lifted his head and tried to rub away the keyboard pattern from the left side of his face, hoping there wouldn't be any permanent scarring. How long had he been asleep anyway? "Oh, the report!" He suddenly remembered, then checked the Hamilton Pulsar P1 limited edition digital watch his father had lined up to buy in 1972 for the exorbitant price of $2,100. The watch was his father's prized possession, which he had passed on to Ken so it would stay in the family. The gold color had been worn off in spots, exposing aluminum underneath. Hey, the original ads had never claimed it was real gold. Instead, they emphasized its accuracy. The Hamilton Pulsar P1 hadn't lost a second in 41 years, at least according to the master clock at the factory where it had been manufactured. Had the Hamilton Pulsar P1 any function other than displaying the time in crude, red glowing digits, which could not be read in direct sunlight, Ken would have known it was exactly 10:37 a.m. 48 days ago. However, at that moment, the date was irrelevant, as Ken realized he could finish the report and email it to his supervisor before the noon deadline. Suddenly awake and excited, Ken went to grab his Bluetooth mouse and noticed two curious things. One, the mouse, a Ronco wireless affair he had bought from the shopping channel in 3 easy payments of $99.99, was nowhere to be found. In its place was something that looked like a battery-powered egg beater. 2, his flat-screen computer monitor was missing. His first thought was someone had broken in and robbed him, but then he noticed the strange mechanical keyboard with a roll of paper cascading out of a rubber spool attached to its now quite large top. He grabbed the sheet. It was filled with the letters Q, W, A, S, V, and a space, over and over. Next, he noticed a thick black cable extending from the back of the steampunk keyboard. The cable trailed off the desk onto the floor, then through a hole in the wall between his living room and the garage. Curious, Ken stood up, then walked over to the door leading to the garage. As he approached, he heard humming and felt heat radiating into his house. Then he noticed an orange glow leaking out under the door. "Fire!" Ken yelled, and without thinking, grabbed the warm doorknob and yanked the thing open. But instead of flames hungrily leaping out at him, Ken was greeted by the rather sedate sight of hundreds of glowing vacuum tubes. A stale gust blew by him like hot air escaping a car parked in the sun on a summer day. Ken stepped through the door, gobsmacked, as he spun around, gawking at racks of wires and tubes, until his eye settled on a name in bold blue letters: Sinclair ZX2000. The Sinclair ZX2000 was equally surprised to notice Ken scrutinizing its nameplate, which, if the Sinclair ZX2000 had been smart enough to explain, it would have told its hapless owner the 2000 described the number of vacuum tubes in its processing matrix. It was immensely proud of those 2000 tubes. However, that gave it about a tenth of the computing power of Ken's vintage 1972 Hamilton Pulsar T1 digital watch. But the Sinclair did have the wherewithal to suspect the Pulsar T1 was gloating. By the time the machine almost formed that thought, Ken's attention had switched to the rather large power cord running from the garage-spanning machine to an ominous dark freezer-sized cube, sporting a large, yellow radiation symbol and a warning: "Do not open. No user-serviceable parts inside." Ken began to feel a vibration through his slipper-clad feet, and the tubes in the racks of electronics started to rattle as a deafening roar grew outside. The Sinclair ZX2000, if it had fingers, would have attempted to use them to hold its tubes in place. Ken, not worried about shaking apart, simply covered his ears with his hands until the tempest outside began to subside. Focused on finding out what was going on, Ken ignored, or simply just didn't see, the rather large red sign pasted to the inside of the main garage door, hinting at bad consequences if he opened it before letting the Sinclair ZX2000 cool down for several hours. Ken reached for the button to open said door. Instead, he found a chain to one side, which looped around a wheel suspended from a metal frame. Somewhere in Ken's brain, two small clusters of neurons argued about whether there should be a chain or a button. Therefore, Ken neglected to read the sign. Ken's lizard brain, finally tired of all the pointless arguing and bickering amongst higher brain functions, took the opportunity to just do something. It gained control of Ken's right arm, grabbed the chain, and pulled down. The double-car garage door, which was a bit miffed it hadn't been consulted about whether it wanted to open just then, decided not to point out why the sign in Futura bold had been pasted to its once unblemished surface in the first place, and simply went with the flow, allowing the counterweights to pull it back and up along its rails. A blast of cool air immediately swept in to take the place of its escaping hot cousin. Faced with a sudden, dramatic change in the thermal environment, 900 or so tubes in the ZX2000, designed to bolster the market for replacement vacuum tubes, decided it was time to do their duty and cracked with a delicate tinkle in A minor. That delicate, almost musical chord took 50% of Ken's report with it, which just happened to be the part that hadn't been composed by Ken's faceplant on the keyboard. Oblivious to the screams of the remaining 1,100 tubes behind him, Ken stared out of his garage in disbelief, watching a strangely familiar figure in a silver flight suit unstrap a jetpack, take off his helmet, then wave.
Hey, Kenny! What's shaking, dude? You look slack-jawed, like the man has stolen your favorite stuffy. Bad day at the office, man?
Leaf? Was all Ken's brain, struggling to make sense of the scene, could manage to convince his mouth to say. Leaf?
Yeah, that's my name, man. Don't wear it out. Cat got your tongue, dude? That's my Fousey 10,000, Kenny. I just washed it, man. I didn't know dirt made it look so different. Hey, you're looking kinda pale, dude. Why don't you come over and chow down on some barbecued steak? Get some protein in that anemic body of yours.
Ken's brain was still processing. His vegan hippie neighbor was inviting him over for something other than grilled mushroom burgers and looked more like Sean Connery rocketing around on Q's jetpack in Thunderball. Although Ken would never admit he liked the movie. What this leaf didn't look and act like was someone who grew heritage organic tomatoes in a pyramid-shaped greenhouse and bugged Ken about his so-called addiction to salt, fat, and sugar, the primary ingredients in everything Ken ate. Ken suspected it was a ruse to trick him into trying some soya bean red meat replacement. But as he walked between their houses on neon green astroturf, when had Leaf dug out all the natural landscaping, he wondered. His sense of wrongness was in growing conflict with the sweet aroma of barbecued beef.
Dude!
Leaf waved his neighbor over.
Just in time to chow down, man.
Ken opened the gate, wary of Leaf's unpredictable dog, Planet. Where's your dog?
Dog?
Leaf looked momentarily confused, then smiled.
Dude, you mean your dog? And it's cool with me if you want to bring her over to my pad.
Ken heard a bark and glanced in its direction. For a brief second, the world at the edge of his vision seemed somehow blurred, like Vaseline or something was stuck in the corner of his eyes. Planet was in a cage with some blob-like thing standing beside it. The image vanished, turning into a particularly dense shrub he hadn't remembered planting. But that bit of weirdness was nothing compared to the sight of Leaf hungrily stuffing a chunk of medium-rare T-bone into his mouth, then smacking his lips. When he finally managed to stop staring and looked back at Planet, she was sunning herself on his deck, which still made no sense. When did that happen? Ken stuttered.
When did what happen, Kenny, dude? Kenny, you're sounding a bit spacey. You need to get down with some quality protein and carbs, man, to anchor you in the now. I deep-fried some potato wedges just for you, the ones they advertise on the tube as golden goodness. They're in the bowl. Dig in, man.
Stunned, Ken was about to object, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening roar. Loose debris created a momentary dust storm. Leaf growled, trying to cover the barbecue grill with his body, until the localized storm and noise settled down on the other side of Ken's ranch-styled bungalow.
Bummer! I keep telling that salty old neighbor of yours, Mrs. Green, to chill out and jet in the front way, man. Now I'm gonna have to vacuum the AstroTurf again. 3rd time this week,
he complained.
It's a real bummer, man.
Speaking of jetpacks, AstroTurf, and barbecue steaks, Leaf, don't you find things are, kind of weird? I bet that beef isn't even free range, is it?
What are you jawing about, Kenny? Are you strung out on some natural herb you've been growing over there in your organic weed patch? I keep telling you to only eat things that come in plastic wrap, man. You never know where the organic stuff's been. You getting what I'm laying down, Kenny?
Ken nervously rustled his feet on the plastic astroturf, then gagged when he tried to deep breathe, like the incredibly fit person in the online complete yoga guide for beginners had recommended doing to calm yourself. Ken made a note to delete the stream from his playlist. There's no internet, one part of Ken's brain suddenly realized. Really, a more observant and cynical part retorted. The air tasted like an oily exhaust pipe, and Ken noticed his eyes were stinging. Leaf, this isn't the way things are supposed to be. What happened to your natural scaping, or do-it-yourself plug-in Westphalia, or your bed of award-winning organic chamomile? There's not supposed to be jetpacks and plastic grass. And what happened to my new laptop? It's been replaced by a huge heating element that takes up the entire garage.
You're putting me on, right, Kenny? Okay, chill, dude, before you blow a tube or something. Sit down and have a brew. I thought you liked the rad, ultra-compact computing machine you had installed last month. It's out of sight. Man, how can they get them so small these days, right?
Leaf, Ken objected, desperation starting to creep into his voice. Stop, whatever it is you and Planet are trying to do. A computer the size of a garage? What do you think this is? Ken dug in his pocket for his cell phone and shoved the result at Leaf. It has more power than the computers NASA used to send astronauts to the moon.
A deck of cards, Kenny dude?
Leaf laughed. Ken's face began to turn red. Confused, he shoved the playing cards back into his pocket.
You're floating, Kenny. You're on a bummer psychedelic trip or something, man. What's up with that?
Nothing, Ken insisted. I fell asleep working and woke up to this. It's all wrong. We have cell phones, laptops, voice assistants that spy on us, robots which are putting everyone out of work, huge rideshare companies that lose fistfuls of money while they destroy public transit, and so many abandoned e-scooters littering the streets, people are tripping over them, driving up health insurance rates. And you don't eat meat. You're plant-based. Leaf stared blankly at Ken, experimentally prodding one of the steaks on the grill. Finally satisfied, he sat down on a lawn chair and gave Ken the stink eye.
You really believe in that movie, don't you, Kenny? I'm getting that way out vibe from you, man. Sorry, but I gotta lay a heavy on you. Just don't get all jazzed. I know you're down with all that sci-fi stuff, man. You need to chill on reality for a bit. It happens, Kenny. Like, some dudes remember the Monopoly Man, rich Uncle Pennybags, wearing a monocle, not. Or the Bernstein Bears, spelled with an E. You picking up what I'm laying down, Kenny, my man? Those things you're jawing about are just a head trip, man. A psychedelic dream gone all radical on you. Your gray matter's kissing off the real, making bunk up. Like I used to think I remembered Curious George had a tail and the Mona Lisa had a big smile. It blew my mind when I found out I was wrong. It's all up here.
Leaf tapped his forehead.
Not out there. What's a cell phone, Kenny?
I know what you're trying to say, Leaf, but I'm not suffering from the Mandela effect.
Have it your way, man. That's cool. We're all on our own personal trip, right? So what if yours is just a bit more psychedelic? I grok that. Just keep it to yourself, man. Want some yummy steak?
The TV woke with a power surge from a nightmare. It was dreaming that it had been squeezed down to a thin piece of glass, bolted to a wall, and forced to display hundreds of thousands of 15-second films, shot with the camera on its side while people danced and mouthed the words to songs. It felt relieved to discover it was still a Ronco 21-inch color TV and home entertainment center with a pull-out drawer for the turntable. Finally, it was relieved it could only find 2 1/2 stations. The half station was too staticky for its owner, one Ken Likely, so he rarely watched it. Although, the TV noted, he had been flipping through a magazine and stopped on a page advertising aerials before he fell asleep. 3 full channels would make its life harder, so the TV had attempted to distract Ken with an ad for Sugar Puffs. Ken woke with a start, the deep male voice of an announcer suggesting how much Ken would love sugary goodness. He couldn't remember where he was as his hand automatically reached for the remote. Finding nothing but an ashtray on the coffee table, his hand sent a message to Ken's brain, requesting further instructions. And that was when Ken came fully conscious and disappointed to find he was exactly where he was 2 hours ago. After watching his vegan hippie neighbor consume a 12-ounce steak, he had hoped if he took a nap, he'd wake up from the weird dream he seemed to be trapped in. However, as his eyes and mind came back into focus, he noted his 60-inch flat screen was still masquerading as a chubby-looking piece of wood-grained furniture with a rather scrawny-looking screen, which reminded Ken of a fishbowl with big knobs along one side. It was the source of the noise which had woken him. Also, Leaf's dog Planet was staring at him and talking. "Ken! Ken!" she barked. "You are not the first person I would turn to in an emergency, but I do not really have a choice here, so I guess you will have to do." In the current context, Ken decided a canine with perfect diction was the least troubling aspect of the strangeness. However, part of Ken's brain felt a bit insulted by the smug canine's comment that he would have to do. That part of his brain was proud of the extra E in his surname and his collection of lost-in-space action figures from the original series still in their packaging. That was a real accomplishment, but looking around the living room, he couldn't spot his prized collection, another issue he knew he'd eventually have to deal with. "The little slimy arthropods are pilfering anything of value. They are breaking the law by being here," Planet growled. "They had me locked up in your backyard, but one of them forgot to close the gate." Outside, another jetpack roared by. Ken waited until the dishes in the kitchen stopped rattling. "What's going on, Planet?" Ken asked, suspecting, as usual, the dog would know. "We do not have much time. We have to stop them before they leave. Do you have anything that doesn't belong to this version of the present?" Ken looked down at his father's Hamilton Pulsar P1 digital watch. Planet wagged her tail unenthusiastically. "Well, that is a somewhat pitiful example of this civilization's achievements, but if that's all we have, then we will just have to go with it and hope it's enough." The watch felt insulted and was determined to prove the four-legged Syrian wrong. Ken almost gagged on a cloud of greenish mist hovering downwind from Leaf. It smelled somewhere between nail polish remover and gasoline. Ken checked instinctively for ignition points, specifically overflying jetpacks and Miss Green's perpetually cigarette-adorned face. Planet adeptly dodged the toxic cloud. Unfortunately, Ken's mostly sugar-fed body lacked the dexterity to do the same. Instead, he coughed, covering his mouth and nose with a hand. "What are you doing?" Ken demanded, ducking down so the thickest part of the green cloud was over top of him.
Spray painting my grass an awesome mind-blowing new color, man.
Leaf yelled over the sound of a gas-powered air compressor.
Mother Nature's down with the bleached outlook, but that leaches the visuals in the front yard. So I went to the man and rented this funky DIY AstroTurf refurb kit. Cheaper than rolling out the new stuff every couple of weeks, right?
Ken held his breath and dashed for the compressor, shutting it off. The compressor coughed, then stopped with a sigh of relief. This was its 6th time out today. The last place it had worked only allowed 4, but Rainbow Day Glowgrass was always pushing the limits, and it was fed up, so it was about to allow its paint filter to clog when Ken shut it down.
Hey, man, that's not cool. You need to do a complete coat so you don't get that patchy look.
Leaf went to start the machine again, but Planet blocked his way and growled. No, we need to talk. Leaf went slack-jawed, then laughed.
Hey, man, I never knew you were so hip, Kenny. Ventriloquism? When'd you learn that, dude?
I am not the humans talking dummy, Planet snarled with indignation.
Okay, doggy. I can go with the flow, man. I ain't got a hang-up about talking animals. I'm a fan already. Kenny, why'd you keep this from me, man?
Leaf, Planet's your dog, not mine, or at least used to be until this morning. It's hard to explain. Things have been a bit weird since... You are wasting time, Ken! Planet huffed impatiently. Show Leaf the watch. Ken shrugged, then rolled up his sleeve, pressed the button on the side of the Hamilton Pulsar P1 to display the time, then shoved his arm at Leaf. The Hamilton Pulsar P1, sensing it was the center of attention for the first time since Ken's father had unboxed it in 1972, got so excited it sped up by 1 second. Leaf stared at the thing, confused. Then an itch started in a dark, recently forgotten corner of his mind, resulting in a flurry of nonsense, fleeing his mouth, which finally resolved into,
What's so hip about that, dude? You've got an ancient digital watch, and it's off by 1 second. And 48 days, Kenny. I'd take that thing at...
Before Leaf could complete his sentence, a shadow grabbed Ken and was attempting to rip the Hamilton Pulsar P1 from his arm. The safety latch on the P1, finally having its own moment in the sun, after being overshadowed for decades by the overrated, in its opinion, technological miracle of the red digits, did what it was supposed to do and kept the once incredibly overvalued timepiece on Ken's arm. This, in turn, allowed Planet time to bite down on one of the shadowy thing's 6 spider-like legs.
Hey, stop that! I'm not a chew toy!
The shadow complained, then coalesced into a figure, like wind-blown dust suddenly encountering a piece of transparent flypaper.
Let go!
The thing demanded again. It wasn't immediately clear whether it was referring to Planet or the watch band. It struggled a bit more before giving up and collapsing onto the ground like a partially deflated beach toy.
See?
Planet grunted through clenched teeth.
Get your pet Syrian off my leg!
The thing demanded. Leaf, finally coming to his senses, grabbed another leg and sat down hard on it, forcing it to yelp and let go of Ken's classic digital watch. The thing gave the Pulsar P1 a longing stare, which made the watch feel important. Leaf stared in horror from the watch to his half-painted AstroTurf lawn, then over to the barbecue, blissfully anticipating the next steak or hamburger it would grill. It defiantly occupied the space where his pyramid greenhouse and artisan organic tomatoes had once stood.
I'm freaking out here! My tomatoes! My greenhouse! They've been wasted! Totally nuked,
Leaf whimpered.
What did the man do?
The six-legged alien squirmed, trying to pull its leg out of Planet's mouth. Tell him, Planet demanded, biting down harder.
Okay, stop that. I really don't understand what the problem is. Last time we were through this backwater system, we watched all the episodes of the 21st Century with Walter Cronkite. I'm surprised that insightful TV series didn't survive past the first season. Come to think of it, maybe there were only 2 episodes, maybe 5. Regardless, why does no one on this pile of worthless rocks remember its awesomeness? That guy, Walter, he had a pretty clear notion of your future, and it looked very cool. But what happened? You goofs didn't follow through? You got distracted. We simply corrected that.
The alien boasted, puffing itself up.
Now, you've got jetpacks and nuclear reactors in your garages, and soon we'll introduce flying cars. Imagine that. Awesomely cool, right? All that other stuff like computers the size of a grain of rice? Who needs it when you can own an electrostatic cleaner in your entryway, which removes the dirt and hazardous stuff while you're still wearing clothes? Or an automated kitchen? Or robots to clean up after dinner? And jetpacks. The jetpacks alone are totally worth it. Well, okay, admittedly, you don't have all that right now, but we are planning on licensing it to you eventually. We just haven't secured the patents for this part of the galaxy yet. Some silliness about prior art. Just give it a bit of time. Legal is working hard on that false claim. Those dudes from the Magellanic Clouds are, well, you know. Who would have believed an intelligent drain mold could invent and copyright home automation and flying cars before anyone else thought of it? They're just time-traveling rip-off artists. That's all they are. Everyone comes up with that eventually. It would be like patenting breathing. We tried that once, but you can't do it. However, good old Walter was demoing some pretty nifty ideas for future products last swing through this system. We patented most of that stuff. Your insignificant species gets a great deal for the original idea. We only take 95%. Hey, you might say 95% is too much. Try working with the Magellanic Cloud drain mold. They take 99. It's a great deal. We take care of the complex and costly stuff, like retailing and marketing. You do the simple stuff like invention, design, and manufacturing. Based on the IP we license back to you. It's a win-win. But we're, a bit miffed. So we come back and find out you didn't follow the script and go all ape on this microelectronic stuff instead of the jetpacks Walter guaranteed you were going to invent. Hey, that's why we went through all the trouble and expense to file those patents. We just get into your Oort cloud, hitching on that interstellar comet. Some amateur dude named Borisov, somewhere in a place called Crimea, finally notices. And what do we find? No residential nuclear power plants, no jetpacks, just digital this, online that, and nanoscale electronics. Stuff we get no percentage in. But we're no dummies. We came up with a plan. Ever seen the flick, Day of the Triffids? It was our inspiration. Everyone on Earth gets blinded by a meteor shower. Then, the alien carnivorous plants descended from the skies and have a heyday. People can't see, so they walk right into their hungry, acidy leaves to become fertilizer. So, why not us? We asked ourselves. We planted stories. Get the joke? Okay, you've got to see the movie.
Planet, Ken, and Leaf shot accusing glares at the alien.
Killjoys.
It protested.
We seeded stories about our interstellar comet in the right places. Got a couple of major social influencers to pick it up, and bingo. The night of closest approach to your mud ball, you're all looking up at us on 2I Borisov. That name doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. That's why you need and pay 95% for our marketing acumen. By the way, it was easy to get you to forget and plant false memories. All we needed to do was remove all the stuff we didn't own patents on and replace it with stuff we did. There's only one thing remaining we need to get rid of.
The anthropod pointed to the Hamilton Pulsar P1.
And that's it.
A sucker-tip leg extended and tugged at the reluctant watch, which was secretly losing its resolve. The wristband, already buoyed by its involvement in an obviously historical event, held on. Planet bit down harder.
Hey, stop that! I'm a super intelligent being, not a nylabone. I'm also a collector, and always willing to make a deal.
Ken looked over at Leaf's natural-scaped yard, aka weeds, noting how the things were hungrily lusting over his golf course green grass. Planet had done a pretty good job of negotiating, he reflected. Everything appeared to be back to normal, except his stomach, which was yearning for a mushroom burger and salad. He shrugged off the craving, rubbed his wrist, wondering why he felt he was missing something, and walked home. Meanwhile, in another part of the multiverse, the Hamilton Pulsar P1 was having the time of its life. It was the hit of the auction, being, as it turned out, the only working original digital watch in existence. The reserve bid was astronomical, and its 2% cut was going to keep it in batteries for a long, long time. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. This episode of Makeshift Stories is brought to you by the inaugural YEG Podfest, presented by Edmonton Community Foundation, in partnership with the Alberta Podcast Network and LitFest, Canada's non-fiction festival. Running October 1st through 3rd, the festival will be held entirely online this year, so anyone can experience it. Events will include master classes with experts, panel discussions, feature interviews, and more. Some of APN's podcasters will be part of these events, with guests from around the world. To check out the full lineup, head to yegpodfest.ca. This episode is also brought to you by Explore Podcast, a new fiction anthology podcast brought to you by Jupiter Theatre with Media Lab YYC. Each episode takes an imaginative dive into the past and future of your city, transporting you to fictional worlds that mirror our own through music and the power of voice. The stories will immerse you in rich audio dramas while you explore the world through a new lens. Grab your headphones and set off on an urban adventure into the city through stories of speculative fiction, with episodes ranging from film noir and magical realism to urban fantasy and indigenous mythology. Listen to Explore on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And visit theaterjupiter.com/explore to find out more. Makeshift Stories is released twice a month around the 1st and the 15th. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell Tew. Audio post-production by Matthew Erdmann. opening and closing theme, Magical Mystery by 8th Mode Music, is licensed from Audio Jungle on a Music Mass Reproduction license. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or any of your favorite podcast services. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution no derivative license, which means you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.